Chapter 26. The remainder of the trial consisted of the testimony of 11 witnesses, 4 for Mason and 7 for Clyde. One of the latter, a Dr. A.K. Sword, of Rehoboth, chancing to be at Big Bittern on the day that Roberta's body was returned to the boathouse, now declared that he had seen and examined it there and that the wounds, as they appeared then, did not seem to him as other than such as might have been delivered by such a blow as Clyde admitted to having struck accidentally, and that unquestionably Miss Alden had been drowned while conscious, and not unconscious, as the state would have the jury believe, a result which led Mason into an inquiry concerning the gentleman's medical history, which, alas, was not as impressive as it might have been. He had been graduated from a second-rate medical school in Oklahoma and had practiced in a small town ever since. In addition to him, and entirely apart from the crime with which Clyde was charged, there was Samuel Yersley, one of the farmers from around Gun Lodge, who, driving over the road which Roberta's body had traveled in being removed from Big Bittern to Gun Lodge, now earnestly swore that the road, as he had noticed in driving over it that same morning, was quite rough, making it possible for Belknap, who was examining him, to indicate that this was at least an approximate cause of the extra severity of the wounds upon Roberta's head and face. This bit of testimony was later contradicted, however, by a rival witness for Mason, the driver for Lutz Brothers, no less, who as earnestly swore that he found no ruts or rough places whatsoever in the road. And again there were Liggett and Whigham to say that insofar as they had been able to note or determine, Clyde's conduct in connection with his technical efforts for Griffiths and Company had been attentive, faithful and valuable. They had seen no official harm in him. And then several other minor witnesses to say that insofar as they had been able to observe his social comings and goings, Clyde's conduct was most circumspect, ceremonious and guarded. He had done no ill that they knew of. But, alas, as Mason in cross-examining them was quick to point out, they had never heard of Roberta Alden or her trouble or even of Clyde's social relationship with her. Finally, many small and dangerous and difficult points having been bridged or buttressed or fended against as well as each side could, it became Belknap's duty to say his last word for Clyde. And to this he gave an entire day, most carefully, and in the spirit of his opening address, retracing and emphasizing every point which tended to show how almost unconsciously, if not quite innocently, Clyde had fallen into the relationship with Roberta which had ended so disastrously for both. Mental and moral cowardice, as he now reiterated, inflamed or at least operated on by various lacks in Clyde's early life, plus new opportunities such as previously had never appeared to be within his grasp, had affected his perhaps too pliable and sensual and impractical and dreamy mind. No doubt he had not been fair to Miss Alden. No question as to that. He had not. But on the other hand, and as had been most clearly shown by the confession which the defense had elicited, he had not proved ultimately so cruel or vile as the prosecution would have the public and this honorable jury believe. Many men were far more cruel in their love life than this young boy had ever dreamed of being, and of course they were not necessarily hung for that. And in passing technically on whether this boy had actually committed the crime charged, it was incumbent upon this jury to see that no generous impulse relating to what this poor girl might have suffered in her love relations with this youth be permitted to sway them to the belief or decision that for that this youth had committed the crime specifically stated in the indictment. Who among both sexes were not cruel at times in their love life, the one to the other. And then a long and detailed indictment of the purely circumstantial nature of the evidence, no single person having seen or heard anything of the alleged crime itself, whereas Clyde himself had explained most clearly how he came to find himself in the peculiar situation in which he did find himself. And after that, a brushing aside of the incident of the folder, as well as Clyde's not remembering the price of the boat at Big Bittern, his stopping to bury the tripod and his being so near Roberta and not aiding her, as either being mere accidents of chance, or memory, or, in the case of his failing to go to her rescue, of his being dazed, confused, frightened, hesitating fatally but not criminally at the one time in his life when he should not have hesitated, a really strong if Jesuitical plea which was not without its merits and its weight. And then Mason, blazing with his conviction that Clyde was a murderer of the coldest and blackest type, and spending an entire day in riddling the spider's tissue of lies and unsupported statements with which the defense was hoping to divert the minds of the jury from the unbroken and unbreakable chain of amply substantiated evidence wherewith the prosecution had proved the spirited man to be the red-handed murderer that he was. And with hours spent in retracing the statements of the various witnesses, and other hours in denouncing Clyde, or retelling the bitter miseries of Roberta, so much so that the jury, as well as the audience, was once more on the verge of tears. And with Clyde deciding in his own mind as he sat between Belknap and Jeffson, that no jury such as this was likely to acquit him in the face of evidence so artfully and movingly recapitulated. And then Oberwalzer from his high seat finally instructing the jury, "Gentlemen, all evidence is, in a strict sense, more or less circumstantial, whether consisting of facts which permit the inference of guilt or whether given by an eyewitness. The testimony of an eyewitness is, of course, based upon circumstances. If any of the material facts of the case are at variance with the probability of guilt, it will be the duty of you gentlemen to give the defendant the benefit of the doubt raised. And it must be remembered that evidence is not to be discredited or decried because it is circumstantial. It may often be more reliable evidence than direct evidence. Much has been said here concerning motive and its importance in this case, but you are to remember that proof of motive is by no means indispensable or essential to conviction. While a motive may be shown as a circumstance to aid in fixing a crime, yet the people are not required to prove a motive. If the jury finds that Roberta Alden accidentally or involuntarily fell out of the boat and that the defendant made no attempt to rescue her, that does not make the defendant guilty and the jury must find the defendant not guilty. On the other hand, if the jury finds that the defendant in any way, intentionally, there and then brought about or contributed to that fatal accident, either by a blow or otherwise, it must find the defendant guilty. While I do not say that you must agree upon your verdict, I would suggest that you ought not, any of you, place your minds in a position which will not yield if after careful deliberation you find you are wrong. So, Justice Oberwalzer, solemnly and didactically from his high seat to the jury. And then, that point having been reached, the jury rising and filing from the room at 5 in the afternoon. And Clyde immediately thereafter being removed to his cell before the audience proper was allowed to leave the building. There was constant fear on the part of the sheriff that he might be attacked. And after that 5 long hours in which he waited, walking to and fro, in his cell, or pretending to read or rest, the while Kraut or Sissel, tipped by various representatives of the press for information as to how Clyde took it at this time, slyly and silently remained as near as possible to watch. And in the meantime Justice Oberwalzer and Mason and Belknap and Jeffson, with their attendants and friends, in various rooms of the Bridgeburg Central Hotel, dining and then waiting impatiently, with the aid of a few drinks, for the jury to agree, and wishing and hoping that the verdict would be reached soon, whatever it might be. And in the meantime the 12 men, farmers, clerks and storekeepers, recanvassing for their own mental satisfaction the fine points made by Mason and Belknap and Jeffson. Yet out of the whole 12 but one man, Samuel Upham, a druggist, politically opposed to Mason and taken with the personality of Jeffson, sympathizing with Belknap and Jeffson. And so pretending that he had doubts as to the completeness of Mason's proof until at last after 5 ballots were taken he was threatened with exposure and the public rage and obloquy which was sure to follow in case the jury was hung. "We'll fix you. You won't get by with this without the public knowing exactly where you stand." Whereupon, having a satisfactory drug business in North Mansfield, he at once decided that it was best to pocket this opposition to Mason and agree. Then 4 hollow knocks on the door leading from the jury room to the courtroom. It was the foreman of the jury, Foster Lund, a dealer in cement, lime and stone. His great fist was knocking. And at that the hundreds who had crowded into the hot stuffy courtroom after dinner, though many had not even left, stirred from the half-stupor into which they had fallen. "What's that? What's happened? Is the jury ready to report? What's the verdict?" And men and women and children starting up to draw nearer the excluding rail. And the two deputies on guard before the jury door beginning to call, "All right. All right. As soon as the judge comes." And then other deputies hurrying to the prison over the way in order that the sheriff might be notified and Clyde brought over, and to the Bridgeburg Central Hotel to summon Oberwalzer and all the others. And then Clyde, in a half-stupor or daze from sheer loneliness and killing suspense, being manacled to crowd and led over between Slack, Sissel and others, and Oberwalzer, Mason, Belknap and Jeffson and the entire company of newspaper writers, artists, photographers and others entering and taking the places that they had occupied all these long weeks. And Clyde winking and blinking as he was seated behind Belknap and Jeffson now, not with them, for as stoutly manacled as he was to Kraut, he was compelled to sit by him. And then Oberwalzer on the bench and the clerk in his place, the jury room door being opened and the 12 men filing solemnly in, quaint and varied figures in angular and for the most part much worn suits of the ready-made variety. And as they did so, seating themselves in the jury box, only to rise again at the command of the clerk, who began, "Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed on a verdict?" Yet without one of them glancing in the direction of either Belknap or Jeffson or Clyde, which Belknap at once interpreted as fatal. "It's all off," he whispered to Jeffson. "Against us. I can tell." And then Lund announcing, "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." And Clyde, entirely dazed and yet trying to keep his poise and remain serene, gazing straight before him toward the jury and beyond, and with scarcely a blink of the eye. For had he not, in his cell the night before, been told by Jeffson, who had found him deeply depressed, that the verdict in this trial, assuming that it proved to be unfavorable, was of no consequence. The trial from start to finish had been unfair. Prejudice and bias had governed its every step. Such bullying and browbeating and innuendo as Mason had indulged in before the jury would never pass as fair or adequate in any higher court. And a new trial, on appeal, would certainly be granted, although by whom such an appeal was to be conducted he was not now prepared to discuss. And now, recalling that, Clyde saying to himself that it did not so much matter perhaps, after all. It could not, really, or could it? Yet think what these words meant in case he could not get a new trial. Death. That is what it would mean if this were final, and perhaps it was final. And then to sit in that chair he had seen in his mind's eye for so long, these many days and nights when he could not force his mind to drive it away. Here it was again before him, that dreadful, ghastly chair, only closer and larger than ever before, there in the very center of the space between himself and Justice Oberwalzer. He could see it plainly now, squarish, heavy-armed, heavy-backed, some straps at the top and sides. God! Supposing no one would help him now? Even the Griffiths might not be willing to pay out any more money. Think of that. The Court of Appeals to which Jeffson and Belknap had referred might not be willing to help him either. And then these words would be final. They would. They would. God! His jaws moved slightly, then set, because at the moment he became conscious that they were moving. Besides, at that moment Belknap was rising and asking for an individual poll of the jury, while Jeffson leaned over and whispered, "Don't worry about it. It isn't final. We'll get a reversal as sure as anything." Yet as each of the jurors was saying, yes, Clyde was listening to them, not to Jeffson. Why should each one say that with so much emphasis? Was there not one who felt that he might not have done as Mason had said, struck her intentionally? Was there not one who even half believed in that change of heart which Belknap and Jeffson had insisted that he had experienced? He looked at them all, little and big. They were like a blackish-brown group of wooden toys with creamish-brown or old ivory faces and hands. Then he thought of his mother. She would hear of this now, for here were all these newspaper writers and artists and photographers assembled to hear this. And what would the Griffiths, his uncle and Gilbert, think now? And Sandra? Sandra? Not a word from her. And through all this he had been openly testifying, as Belknap and Jephson had agreed that he must do, to the compelling and directing power of his passion for her, the real reason for all this. But not a word. And she would not send him any word now, of course, she who had been going to marry him and give him everything. But in the meantime the crowd about him silent, although, or perhaps because, intensely satisfied. The little devil hadn't gotten by. He hadn't fooled the 12 sane men of this county with all that bunk about a change of heart. What rot! While Jephson sat and stared, and Belknap, his strong face written all over with contempt and defiance, making his motions. And Mason and Burla and Newcomb and Redmond thinly repressing their intense satisfaction behind masks preternaturally severe, the while Belknap continued with a request that the sentence be put off until the following Friday, a week hence, when he could more conveniently attend, but with Justice Oberwalzer replying that he thought not, unless some good reason could be shown. But on the morrow, if counsel desired, he would listen to an argument. If it were satisfactory he would delay sentence, otherwise, pronounce it the following Monday. Yet, even so, Clyde was not concerned with this argument at the moment. He was thinking of his mother and what she would think, feel. He had been writing her so regularly, insisting always that he was innocent and that she must not believe all, or even a part, of what she read in the newspapers. He was going to be acquitted, sure. He was going to go on the stand and testify for himself. But now? Now? Oh, he needed her now, so much. Quite everyone, as it seemed now, had forsaken him. He was terribly, terribly alone. And he must send her some word quickly. He must. He must. And then asking Jephson for a piece of paper and a pencil, he wrote, Mrs. A.S.A. Griffiths, care of Star of Hope Mission, Denver, Colorado. Dear Mother, I am convicted, Clyde. And then handing that to Jephson, he asked him, nervously and weakly, if he would see that it was sent right away. Right away, son, sure, replied Jephson, touched by his looks, and waving to a press boy who was near gave it to him together with the money. And then, while this was going on, all the public exits being locked until Clyde, accompanied by Sissel and Kraut, had been ushered through the familiar side entrance through which he had hoped to escape. And while all the press and the public and the still remaining jury gazing, for even yet they had not seen enough of Clyde but must stare into his face to see how he was taking it. And because of the local feeling against him, Justice Oberwalzer, at Slack's request, holding court unadjourned until word was brought that Clyde was once more locked in his cell, whereupon the doors were reopened. And then the crowd surging out but only to wait at the courtroom door in order to glimpse, as he passed out, Mason, who now, of all the figures in this case, was the true hero, the nemesis of Clyde, the avenger of Roberta. That he not appearing at first but instead Jephson and Belknap together, and not so much depressed as solemn, defiant, Jephson in particular, looking unconquerably contemptuous. Then someone calling, well, you didn't get him off just the same, and Jephson replying, with a shrug of his shoulders, not yet, but this county isn't all of the law either. Then Mason, immediately afterward, a heavy, baggy overcoat thrown over his shoulder, his worn soft hat pulled low over his eyes, and followed by Burla, Haight, Newcomb and others as a royal train, while he walked in the manner of one entirely oblivious of the meaning or compliment of this waiting throng. For was he not now a victor and an elected judge? And as instantly being set upon by a circling, huzzaing mass, the while a score of those nearest sought to seize him by the hand or place a grateful pat upon his arm or shoulder. Hurrah for Orville! Good for you, Judge! His new or fast approaching title. By God! Orville Mason, you deserve the thanks of this county. Hi-oh! Hey! Hey! 3 cheers for Orville Mason. And with that the crowd bursting into 3 resounding huzzas, which Clyde in his cell could clearly hear and at the same time sense the meaning of. They were cheering Mason for convicting him. In that large crowd out there was not one who did not believe him totally and completely guilty. Roberta, her letters, her determination to make him marry her, her giant fear of exposure, had dragged him down to this. To conviction. To death, maybe. Away from all he had longed for, away from all he had dreamed he might possess. And Sandra. Sandra. Not a word. Not a word. And so now, fearing that crowd or Cecil or someone might be watching, ready to report even now his every gesture, and not willing to show after all how totally collapsed and despondent he really was, he sat down and taking up a magazine pretended to read, the while he looked far, far beyond it to other scenes, his mother, his brother and sisters, the Griffiths, all he had known. But finding these unsubstantiated mind visions a little too much, he finally got up and throwing off his clothes climbed into his iron cot. Convicted. Convicted. And that meant that he must die. God. But how blessed to be able to conceal his face upon a pillow and not let anyone see, however accurately they might guess. Chapter 27. The dreary aftermath of a great contest and a great failure, with the general public from coast to coast, in view of this stern local interpretation of the tragedy, firmly convinced that Clyde was guilty and, as heralded by the newspapers everywhere, that he had been properly convicted. The pathos of that poor little murdered country girl. Her sad letters. How she must have suffered. That weak defense. Even the Griffiths of Denver were so shaken by the evidence as the trial had progressed that they scarcely dared read the papers openly, one to the other, but, for the most part, read of it separately and alone, whispering together afterwards of the damning, awful deluge of circumstantial evidence. Yet, after reading Belknap's speech and Clyde's own testimony, this little family group that had struggled along together for so long coming to believe in their own son and brother in spite of all they had previously read against him, and because of this, during the trial as well as afterwards, writing him cheerful and hopeful letters, based frequently on letters from him in which he insisted over and over again that he was not guilty. Yet once convicted, and out of the depths of his despair wiring his mother as he did, and the papers confirming it, absolute consternation in the Griffiths family. For was not this proof? Or, was it? All the papers seemed to think so. And they rushed reporters to Mrs. Griffiths, who, together with her little brood, had sought refuge from the unbearable publicity in a remote part of Denver entirely removed from the mission world. A Veal moving van company had revealed their address. And now this American witness to the rule of God upon earth, sitting in a chair in her shabby, nondescript apartment, hard-pressed for the very means to sustain herself, degraded by the milling forces of life and the fell and brutal blows of chance, yet serene in her trust, and declaring, "I cannot think this morning. I seem numb and things look strange to me. My boy found guilty of murder. But I am his mother and I am not convinced of his guilt by any means. He has written me that he is not guilty and I believe him. And to whom should he turn with the truth and for trust if not to me? But there is he who sees all things and who knows." At the same time there was so much in the long stream of evidence, as well as Clyde's first folly in Kansas City, that had caused her to wonder, and fear. Why was he unable to explain that folder? Why couldn't he have gone to the girl's aid when he could swim so well? And why did he proceed so swiftly to the mysterious Miss X, whoever she was? Oh, surely, 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 she was not going to be compelled, in spite of all her faith, to believe that her eldest, the most ambitious and hopeful, if restless, of all of her children, was guilty of such a crime. No. She could not doubt him, even now. Under the merciful direction of a living God, was it not evil in a mother to believe evil of a child, however dread his erring ways might seem? In the silence of the different rooms of the mission, before she had been compelled to remove from there because of curious and troublesome visitors, had she not stood many times in the center of one of those miserable rooms while sweeping and dusting, free from the eye of any observer, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, her strong, brown face molded in homely and yet convinced and earnest lines, a figure out of the early biblical days of her 6,000-year-old world, and earnestly directing her thoughts to that imaginary throne which she saw as occupied by the living, giant mind and body of the living God, her Creator. And praying by the quarter and the half hour that she be given strength and understanding and guidance to know of her son's innocence or guilt, and if innocent that this searing burden of suffering be lifted from him and her and all those dear to him and her, or if guilty, she be shown how to do, how to endure the while he be shown how to wash from his immortal soul forever the horror of the thing he had done, make himself once more, if possible, white before the Lord. Thou art mighty, O God, and there is none beside thee. Behold, to thee all things are possible. In thy favor is life. Have mercy, O God. Though his sins be as scarlet, make him white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, make them as wool. Yet in her then, and as she prayed, was the wisdom of Eve in regard to the daughters of Eve. That girl whom Clyde was alleged to have slain, what about her? Had she not sinned too? And was she not older than Clyde? The papers said so. Examining the letters, line by line, she was moved by their pathos and was intensely and pathetically grieved for the misery that had befallen the Aldens. Nevertheless, as a mother and woman full of the wisdom of ancient Eve, she saw how Roberta herself must have consented, how the lure of her must have aided in the weakening and the betrayal of her son. A strong, good girl would not have consented, could not have. How many confessions about this same thing had she not heard in the mission and at street meetings? And might it not be said in Clyde's favor, as in the very beginning of life in the Garden of Eden, the woman tempted me? Truly, and because of that, his mercy endureth forever, she quoted. And if his mercy endureth, must that of Clyde's mother be less? If ye have faith, so much as the grain of a mustard seed, she quoted to herself, and now, in the face of these importuning reporters added, did my son kill her? That is the question. Nothing else matters in the eyes of our Maker, and she looked at the sophisticated, callous youths with the look of one who was sure that her God would make them understand. And even so they were impressed by her profound sincerity and faith. Whether or not the jury has found him guilty or innocent is neither here nor there in the eyes of him who holds the stars in the hollow of his hand. The jury's finding is of men. It is of the earth's earthy. I have read his lawyer's plea. My son himself has told me in his letters that he is not guilty. I believe my son. I am convinced that he is innocent. And A.S.A. in another corner of the room, saying little. Because of his lack of comprehension of the actualities as well as his lack of experience of the stern and motivating forces of passion, he was unable to grasp even a tithe of the meaning of this. He had never understood Clyde or his lacks or his feverish imaginings, so he said, and preferred not to discuss him. But, continued Mrs. Griffiths, at no time have I shielded Clyde in his sin against Roberta Alden. He did wrong, but she did wrong too in not resisting him. There can be no compromising with sin in anyone. And though my heart goes out in sympathy and love to the bleeding heart of her dear mother and father who have suffered so, still we must not fail to see that this sin was mutual and that the world should know and judge accordingly. Not that I want to shield him, she repeated. He should have remembered the teachings of his youth. And here her lips compressed in a sad and somewhat critical misery. But I have read her letters too. And I feel that but for them, the prosecuting attorney would have no real case against my son. He used them to work on the emotions of the jury. She got up, tried as by fire, and exclaimed, tensely and beautifully, but he is my son. He has just been convicted. I must think as a mother how to help him, however I feel as to his sin. She gripped her hands together, and even the reporters were touched by her misery. I must go to him. I should have gone before. I see it now. She paused, discovering herself to be addressing her inmost agony, need, fear, to these public ears and voices, which might in no wise understand or care. Some people wonder, now interrupted one of these same, a most practical and emotionally calloused youth of Clyde's own age, why you weren't there during the trial. Didn't you have the money to go? I had no money, she replied simply. Not enough, anyhow. And besides, they advised me not to come, that they did not need me. But now I must go, in some way, I must find out how." She went to a small shabby desk, which was a part of the sparse and colorless equipment of the room. "You boys are going downtown," she said. "Would one of you send a telegram for me if I give you the money?" "Sure," exclaimed the one who had asked her the rudest question. "Give it to me. You don't need any money. I'll have the paper send it." Also, as he thought, he would write it up, or in, as part of his story. She seated herself at the yellow and scratch desk, and after finding a small pad and pen, she wrote, "Clyde, trust in God. All things are possible to him. Appeal at once. Read Psalm 51. Another trial will prove your innocence. We will come to you soon. Father and Mother. Perhaps I had just better give you the money," she added, nervously, wondering whether it would be well to permit a newspaper to pay for this, and wondering at the same time if Clyde's uncle would be willing to pay for an appeal. It might cost a great deal. Then she added, "It's rather long." "Oh, don't bother about that," exclaimed another of the trio, who was anxious to read the telegram. "Write all you want. We'll see that it goes." "I want a copy of that," added the third, in a sharp and uncompromising tone, seeing that the first reporter was proceeding to take and pocket the message. "This isn't private. I get it from you or her, now." And at this, number one, in order to avoid a scene, which Mrs. Griffiths, in her slow way, was beginning to sense, extracted the slip from his pocket and turned it over to the others, who there and then proceeded to copy it. At the same time that this was going on, the Griffiths of Lycurgus, having been consulted as to the wisdom and cost of a new trial, disclosed themselves as by no means interested, let alone convinced, that an appeal, at least at their expense, was justified. The torture and socially, if not commercially, destroying force of all this, every hour of it a Golgotha. Bella and her social future, to say nothing of Gilbert and his, completely overcast and charred by this awful public picture of the plot and crime that one of their immediate blood had conceived and executed. Samuel Griffiths himself, as well as his wife, fairly macerated by this blasting flash from his well-intentioned, though seemingly impractical and nonsensical good deed. Had not a long, practical struggle with life taught him that sentiment in business was folly? Up to the hour he had met Clyde he had never allowed it to influence him in any way. But his mistaken notion that his youngest brother had been unfairly dealt with by their father. And now this. His wife and daughter compelled to remove from the scene of their happiest years and comforts and live as exiles, perhaps forever, in one of the suburbs of Boston, or elsewhere, or forever endure the eyes and sympathy of their friends. And himself and Gilbert almost steadily conferring ever since as to the wisdom of uniting the business in stock form with some of the others of Lycurgus or elsewhere, or, if not that, of transferring, not by degrees but speedily, to either Rochester or Buffalo or Boston or Brooklyn, where a main plant might be erected. The disgrace of this could only be overcome by absenting themselves from Lycurgus and all that it represented to them. They must begin life all over again, socially at least. That did not mean so much to himself or his wife, their day was about over anyhow. But Bella and Gilbert and Myra, how to rehabilitate them in some way, somewhere? And so, even before the trial was finished, a decision on the part of Samuel and Gilbert Griffiths to remove the business to South Boston, where they might decently submerge themselves until the misery and shame of this had in part at least been forgotten. And because of this further aid to Clyde absolutely refused. And Belknap and Jeffson then sitting down together to consider. For obviously, their time being as valuable as it was, devoted hitherto to the most successful practice in Bridgeburg, and with many matters waiting on account of the pressure of this particular case, they were by no means persuaded that either their practical self-interest or their charity permitted or demanded their assisting Clyde without further recompense. In fact, the expense of appealing this case was going to be considerable as they saw it. The record was enormous. The briefs would be large and expensive, and the state's allowance for them was pitifully small. At the same time, as Jeffson pointed out, it was folly to assume that the Western Griffiths might not be able to do anything at all. Had they not been identified with religious and charitable work this long while? And was it not possible, the tragedy of Clyde's present predicament pointed out to them, that they might through appeals of various kinds raise at least sufficient money to defray the actual costs of such an appeal? Of course, they had not aided Clyde up to the present time, but that was because his mother had been notified that she was not needed. It was different now. Better wire her to come on, suggested Jeffson, practically. We can get Oberwalzer to set the sentence over until the 10th if we say that she is trying to come on here. Besides, just tell her to do it, and if she says she can't, we'll see about the money then. But she'll be likely to get it, and maybe some towards the appeal too. And forthwith a telegram and a letter to Mrs. Griffiths, saying that as yet no word had been said to Clyde, but nonetheless his Lycurgus relatives had declined to assist him further in any way. Besides, he was to be sentenced not later than the 10th, and for his own future welfare it was necessary that someone, preferably herself, appear. Also that funds to cover the cost of an appeal be raised, or at least the same guaranteed. And then Mrs. Griffiths, on her knees praying to her God to help her. Here, now, he must show his almighty hand, his never-failing mercy. Enlightenment and help must come from somewhere, otherwise how was she to get the fare, let alone raise money for Clyde's appeal? Yet as she prayed, on her knees, a thought. The newspapers had been hounding her for interviews. They had followed her here and there. Why had she not gone to her son's aid? What did she think of this? What of that? And now she said to herself, why should she not go to the editor of one of the great papers so anxious to question her always and tell him how great was her need? Also, that if he would help her to reach her son in time to be with him on his day of sentence, that she, his mother, would report the same for him. These papers were sending their reporters here, there, even to the trial, as she had read. Why not her, his mother? Could she not speak and write too? How many tracts had she not composed? And so now to her feet, only to sink once more on her knees. Thou hast answered me, oh, my God! She exclaimed. Then rising, she got out her ancient brown coat, the commonplace brown bonnet with strings, based on some mood in regard to religious livery, and at once proceeded to the largest and most important newspaper. And because of the notoriety of her son's trial, she was shown directly to the managing editor, who was as much interested as he was impressed and who listened to her with respect and sympathy. He understood her situation and was under the impression that the paper would be interested in this. He disappeared for a few moments, then returned. She would be employed as a correspondent for a period of 3 weeks, and after that until further notice. Her expenses to and fro would be covered. An assistant, into whose hands he would now deliver her, would instruct her as to the method of preparing and filing her communications. He would also provide her with some ready cash. She might even leave tonight if she chose, the sooner, the better. The paper would like a photograph or two before she left. But as he talked, and as he noticed, her eyes were closed, her head back. She was offering thanks to the God who had thus directly answered her plea. Chapter 28. Bridgeburg, and a slow train that set down a tired, distrait woman at its depot after midnight on the 8th of December. Bitter cold and bright stars. A lone depot assistant who on inquiry directed her to the Bridgeburg Central House, straight up the street which now faced her, then 2 blocks to her left after she reached the 2nd street. The sleepy night clerk of the Central House providing her instantly with a room and, once he knew who she was, directing her to the county jail. But she deciding after due rumination that now was not the hour. He might be sleeping. She would go to bed and rise early in the morning. She had sent him various telegrams. He knew that she was coming. But as early as 7 in the morning, rising, and by 8 appearing at the jail, letters, telegrams and credentials in hand. And the jail officials, after examining the letters she carried and being convinced of her identity, notifying Clyde of her presence. And he, depressed and forlorn, on hearing this news, welcoming the thought of her as much as at first he had dreaded her coming. For now things were different. All the long grim story had been told. And because of the plausible explanation which Jeffson had provided him, he could face her perhaps and say without a quaver that it was true, that he had not plotted to kill Roberta, that he had not willingly left her to die in the water. And then hurrying down to the visitor's room, where, by the courtesy of Slack, he was permitted to talk with his mother alone. On seeing her rise at his entrance, and hurrying to her, his troubled intricate soul not a little dubious, yet confident also that it was to find sanctuary, sympathy, help, perhaps, and that without criticism, in her heart. And exclaiming with difficulty, as a lump thickened in his throat, "Gee, Ma! I'm glad you've come." But she too moved for words, her condemned boy in her arms, merely drawing his head to her shoulder and then looking up. The Lord God had vouchsafed her this much. Why not more? The ultimate freedom of her son, or if not that, at least a new trial, a fair consideration of the evidence in his favor which had not been had yet, of course. And so they stood for several moments. Then news of home, the reason for her presence, her duty as a correspondent to interview him, later to appear with him in court at the hour of his sentence, a situation over which Clyde winced. Yet now, as he heard from her, his future was likely to depend on her efforts alone. The Lycurgus Griffiths, for reasons of their own, had decided not to aid him further. But she, if she were but able to face the world with a sound claim, might still aid him. Had not the Lord aided her thus far? Yet to face the world and the Lord with her just one plea she must know from him, now, the truth as to whether he had intentionally or unintentionally struck Roberta, whether intentionally or unintentionally he had left her to die. She had read the evidence and his letters and had noted all the defects in his testimony. But were those things as contended by Mason true or false? Clyde, now as always overawed and thrown back on himself by that uncompromising and shameless honesty which he had never been able quite to comprehend in her, announced, with all the firmness that he could muster, yet with a secret quavering chill in his heart, that he had sworn to the truth. He had not done those things with which he had been charged. He had not. But, alas, as she now said to herself, on observing him, what was that about his eyes? A faint flicker perhaps. He was not so sure, as self-convinced and definite as she had hoped, as she had prayed he would be. No, there was something in his manner, his words, as he spoke, a faint recessive intonation, a sense of something troubled, dubious, perhaps, which quite froze her now. He was not positive enough. And so he might have plotted, in part at least, as she had feared at first, when she had first heard of this, might have even struck her on that lone, secret lake! Who could tell? The searing, destroying power of such a thought as that. And that in the face of all his testimony to the contrary. But Jehovah, Jireh, thou wilt not require of a mother, in her own and her son's darkest hour, that she doubt him, make sure his death through her own lack of faith? Oh, no, thou wilt not. O Lamb of God, thou wilt not. She turned, she bruised under her heel the scaly head of this dark suspicion, as terrifying to her as his guilt was to him. O Absalom, my Absalom! Come, we will not entertain such a thought. God himself would not urge it upon a mother. Was he not here, her son, before her, declaring firmly that he had not done this thing? She must believe, she would believe him utterly. She would, and did, whatever fiend of doubt might still remain locked in the lowest dungeon of her miserable heart. Come, the public should know how she felt. She and her son would find a way. He must believe and pray. Did he have a Bible? Did he read it? And Clyde, having been long since provided with a Bible by a prison worker, assured her that he hadn't did read it. But now she must go first to see his lawyers, next to file her dispatch, after which she would return. But once out on the street, being immediately set upon by several reporters and eagerly questioned as to the meaning of her presence here. Did she believe in her son's innocence? Did she or did she not think that he had had a fair trial? Why had she not come on before? And Mrs. Griffiths, in her direct and earnest and motherly way, taking them into her confidence and telling how as well as why she came to be here, also why she had not come before. But now that she was here she hoped to stay. The Lord would provide the means for the salvation of her son, of whose innocence she was convinced. Would they not ask God to help her? Would they not pray for her success? And with the several reporters not a little moved and impressed, assuring her that they would, of course, and thereafter describing her to the world at large as she was, middle-aged, homely, religious, determined, sincere and earnest and with a moving faith in the innocence of her boy. But the Griffiths of Lycurgus, on hearing this, resenting her coming as one more blow. And Clyde, in his cell, on reading of it later, somewhat shocked by the gross publicity now attending everything in connection with him, yet, because of his mother's presence, resigned and after a time almost happy. Whatever her faults or defects, after all she was his mother, wasn't she? And she had come to his aid. Let the public think what it would. Was he not in the shadow of death and she at least had not deserted him? And with this, her suddenly manifested skill in connecting herself in this way with a Denver paper, to praise her for. She had never done anything like this before. And who knew but that possibly, and even in the face of her dire poverty now, she might still be able to solve this matter of a new trial for him and to save his life. Who knew? And yet how much and how indifferently he had sinned against her. Oh, how much! And still here she was, his mother still anxious and tortured and yet loving and seeking to save his life by writing up his own conviction for a Western paper. No longer did the shabby coat and the outlandish hat and the broad, immobile face and somewhat stolid and crude gestures seem the racking and disturbing things they had so little time since. She was his mother and she loved him, and believed in him and was struggling to save him. On the other hand, Belknap and Jeffson on first encountering her were by no means so much impressed. For some reason they had not anticipated so crude and unlettered and yet convinced a figure. The wide, flat shoes. The queer hat. The old brown coat. Yet somehow, after a few moments, arrested by her earnestness and faith and love for her son and her fixed, inquiring, and humanly clean and pure blue eyes in which dwelt immaterial conviction and sacrifice with no shadow of turning. Did they personally think her son innocent? She must know that first. Or did they secretly believe that he was guilty? She had been so tortured by all the contradictory evidence. God had laid a heavy cross upon her and hers. Nevertheless, blessed be his name. And both, seeing and feeling her great concern, were quick to assure her that they were convinced of Clyde's innocence. If he were executed for this alleged crime it would be a travesty on justice. Yet both, now that they saw her, troubled as to the source of any further funds, her method of getting here, which she now explained, indicating that she had nothing. And an appeal sure to cost not less than $2,000. And Mrs. Griffiths, after an hour in their presence, in which they made clear to her the basic cost of an appeal, covering briefs to be prepared, arguments, trips to be made, asserting repeatedly that she did not quite see how she was to do. Then suddenly, and to them somewhat inconsequentially, yet movingly and dramatically, exclaiming, "The Lord will not desert me. I know it. He has declared himself unto me. It was his voice there in Denver that directed me to that paper. And now that I am here, I will trust him and he will guide me." But Belknap and Jeffson merely looking at one another in unconvinced and pagan astonishment. Such faith! An exhorter! An evangelist, no less. Yet to Jeffson, here was an idea. There was the religious element to be reckoned with everywhere, strong in its agreement with just such faith. Assuming the Griffiths of Lycurgus to remain obdurate and unmoved, why then, and now that she was here, there were the churches and the religious people generally. Might it not be possible, with such a temperament and such faith as this, to appeal to the very element that had hitherto most condemned Clyde and made his conviction a certainty, for funds wherewith to carry this case to the Court of Appeals? This lorn mother. Her faith in her boy. Presto! A lecture, at so much for admission, and in which, hard-pressed as she was and could show, she would set forth the righteousness of her boy's claim, seek to obtain the sympathy of the prejudiced public and incidentally $2,000 or more with which this appeal could be conducted. And now Jefferson, turning to her and laying the matter before her and offering to prepare a lecture or notes, a condensation of his various arguments, in fact, an entire lecture which she could rearrange and present as she chose, all the data which was the ultimate, basic truth in regard to her son. And she, her brown cheeks flushing and her eyes brightening, agreeing she would do it. She would try. She could do no less than try. Verily, verily, was not this the voice and hand of God in the darkest hour of her tribulation? On the following morning Clyde was arraigned for sentence, with Mrs. Griffiths given a seat near him and seeking, paper and pencil in hand, to make notes of, for her, an unutterable scene, while a large crowd surveyed her. His own mother. And acting as a reporter. Something absurd, grotesque, insensitive, even ludicrous, about such a family and such a scene. And to think the Griffiths of Lycurgus should be so immediately related to them. Yet Clyde sustained and heartened by her presence. For had she not returned to the jail the previous afternoon with her plan? And as soon as this was over, whatever the sentence might be, she would begin with her work. And so, and that almost in spite of himself, in his darkest hour, standing up before Justice Oberwalzer and listening first to a brief recital of his charge and trial, which was pronounced by Oberwalzer to have been fair and impartial, then to the customary, "Have you any cause which shows why the judgment of death should not now be pronounced against you according to law?" To which, and to the astonishment of his mother and the auditors, if not Jefferson, who had advised and urged him so to do, Clyde now in a clear and firm voice replied, "I am innocent of the crime as charged in the indictment. I never killed Roberta Alden and therefore I think this sentence should not be passed." And then staring straight before him, conscious only of the look of admiration and love turned on him by his mother. For had not her son now declared himself, here at this fatal moment, before all these people? And his word here, if not in that jail, would be true, would it not? Then her son was not guilty. He was not. He was not. Praised be the name of the Lord in the highest. And deciding to make a great point of this in her dispatch, so as to get it in all the papers, and in her lecture afterwards. However, Oberwalzer, without the faintest sign of surprise or perturbation, now continued, "Is there anything else you care to say?" "No," replied Clyde, after a moment's hesitation. "Clyde Griffiths," then concluded Oberwalzer, "the judgment of the court is that you, Clyde Griffiths, for the murder in the first degree of one, Roberta Alden, whereof you are convicted, and you are hereby sentenced to the punishment of death, and it is ordered that, within 10 days after this day's session of court, the sheriff of this county of Cataraqui deliver you, together with the warrant of this court, to the agent and warden of the state prison of the state of New York at Auburn, where you shall be kept in solitary confinement until the week beginning Monday the 28th day of January, 19, and, upon some day within the week so appointed, the said agent and warden of the state prison of the state of New York at Auburn is commended to do execution upon you, Clyde Griffiths, in the mode and manner prescribed by the laws of the state of New York." And that done, a smile from Mrs. Griffiths to her boy and an answering smile from Clyde to her. For since he had announced that he was not guilty, here, her spirit had risen in the face of this sentence. He was really innocent, he must be, since he had declared it here. And Clyde, because of her smile, saying to himself, his mother believed in him now. She had not been swayed by all the evidence against him. And this faith, mistaken or not, was now so sustaining, so needed. What he had just said was true as he now saw it. He had not struck Roberta. That was true. And therefore he was not guilty. Yet Kraut and Slack were once more seizing him and escorting him to the cell. Immediately thereafter his mother, seating herself at a press table, proceeded to explain to contiguous press representatives now curiously gathering about her, "You mustn't think too badly of me, you gentlemen of the papers. I don't know much about this, but it is the only way I could think of to be with my boy. I couldn't have come otherwise. And then one lanky correspondent stepping up to say, "Don't worry, Mother. Is there any way I can help you? Want me to straighten out what you want to say? I'll be glad to." And then sitting down beside her and proceeding to help her arrange her impressions in the form in which he assumed her Denver paper might like them. And others as well offering to do anything they could, and all greatly moved. 2 days later, the proper commitment papers having been prepared and his mother notified of the change but not permitted to accompany him, Clyde was removed to Auburn, the Western Penitentiary of the state of New York, where in the death house or murderer's row, as it was called, as gloomy and torturesome an inferno as one could imagine any human compelled to endure, a combination of some 22 cells on 2 separate levels, he was to be restrained until ordered retried or executed. Yet as he traveled from Bridgeburg to this place, impressive crowds at every station, young and old, men, women and children, all seeking a glimpse of the astonishingly youthful lair. And girls and women, under the guise of kindly interest, but which, at best, spelled little more than a desire to achieve a facile intimacy with this daring and romantic, if unfortunate figure, throwing him a flower here and there and calling to him gaily and loudly as the train moved out from one station or another, "Hello, Clyde. Hope to see you soon again. Don't stay too long down there. If you take an appeal, you're sure to be acquitted. We hope so, anyhow." And with Clyde not a little astonished and later even heartened by this seemingly favorable discrepancy between the attitude of the crowds in Bridgeburg and this sudden, morbid, feverish and even hectic curiosity here, bowing and smiling and even waving with his hand. Yet thinking, nonetheless, I am on the way to the death house and they can be so friendly. It is a wonder they dare. And with Kraut and Cecil, his guards, because of the distinction and notoriety of being both his captors and jailers, as well also because of these unusual attentions from passengers on the train and individuals in these throngs without being themselves flattered and ennobled. But after this one brief colorful flight in the open since his arrest, past these waiting throngs and over winter sun-lit fields and hills of snow that reminded him of Lycurgus, Sondra, Roberta, and all that he had so kaleidoscopically and fatally known in the 20 months just past, the grey and restraining walls of Auburn itself, with, once he was presented to a clerk in the warden's office and his name and crime entered in the books, himself assigned to 2 assistants, who saw to it that he was given a prison bath and haircut, all the wavy, black hair he so much admired cut away, a prison striped uniform and hideous cap of the same material, prison underwear and heavy grey felt shoes to quiet the restless prison tread in which in time he might indulge, together with the number, 77,221. And so accoutred, immediately transferred to the death house proper, where in a cell on the ground floor he was now locked, a squarish-like clean space, 8 by 10 feet in size and fitted with sanitary plumbing as well as a cot bed, a table, a chair and a small rack for books. And here then, while he barely sensed that there were other cells about him, ranging up and down a wide hall, he first stood, and then seated himself, now no longer buoyed by the more intimate and sociable life of the jail at Bridgeburg, or those strange throngs and scenes that had punctuated his trip here. The hectic tensity and misery of these hours. That sentence to die, that trip with all those people calling to him, that cutting of his hair downstairs in that prison barber shop, and by a convict, the suit and underwear that was now his and that he now had on. There was no mirror here, or anywhere, but no matter, he could feel how he looked. This baggy coat and trousers and this striped cap. He threw it hopelessly to the floor. For but an hour before he had been clothed in a decent suit and shirt and tie and shoes, and his appearance had been neat and pleasing as he himself had thought as he left Bridgeburg. But now, how must he look? And tomorrow his mother would be coming, and later Jefferson or Belknap, maybe. God! But worse, there, in that cell directly opposite him, a sallow and emaciated and sinister-looking Chinaman in a suit exactly like his own, who had come to the bars of his door and was looking at him out of inscrutable slant eyes, but as immediately turning and scratching himself. Vermin, maybe, as Clyde immediately feared. There had been bedbugs at Bridgeburg. A Chinese murderer. For was not this the death house? But as good as himself here. And with a garb like his own. Thank God visitors were probably not many. He had heard from his mother that scarcely any were allowed, that only she and Belknap and Jeffson and any minister he chose might come once a week. But now these hard, white-painted walls brightly lighted by wide unobstructed skylights by day and as he could see, by incandescent lamps in the hall without at night, yet all so different from Bridgeburg, so much more bright or harsh illuminatively. For there, the jail being old, the walls were a grey-brown, and not very clean, the cells larger, the furnishings more numerous, a table with a cloth on it at times, books, papers, a chess, and checkerboard, whereas here was nothing, these hard narrow walls, the iron bars rising to a heavy solid ceiling above, and that very, very heavy iron door which yet, like the one at Bridgeburg, had a small hole through which food would be passed, of course. But just then a voice from somewhere, "Hey! We got a new one with us, fellers. Ground tier, second cell, east." And then a second voice, "You don't say? What's he like?" And a third, "What's your name, new man? Don't be scared. You ain't no worse off than the rest of us." And then the first voice, answering number 2, kinda tall and skinny. "A kid. Looks a little like mama's boy, but not bad at that. Hey, you. Tell us your name." And Clyde, amazed and dumb and pondering. For how was one to take such an introduction as this? What to say, what to do? Should he be friendly with these men? Yet, his instinct for tact prompting him even here to reply, most courteously and promptly, "Clyde Griffiths." And one of the first voices continuing, "Oh, sure. We know who you are. Welcome, Griffiths. We ain't as bad as we sound. We been readin' a lot about you, up dear in Bridgeburg. We thought you'd be along pretty soon now." And another voice, "You don't want to be too down. It ain't so worse here. At least de place is all right, a roof over your head, as they say." And then a laugh from somewhere. But Clyde, too horrified and sickened for words, was sadly gazing at the walls and door, then over at the Chinaman, who, silent at his door, was once more gazing at him. Horrible. Horrible. And they talked to each other like that, and to a stranger among them so familiarly. No thought for his wretchedness, his strangeness, his timidity, the horror he must be suffering. But why should a murderer seem timid to anyone, perhaps, or miserable? Worst of all, they had been speculating here as to how long it would be before he would be along, which meant that everything concerning him was known here. Would they nag, or bully, or make trouble for one unless one did just as they wished? If Sandra, or any one of all the people he had known, should see or even dream of him as he was here now. God! And his own mother was coming tomorrow. And then an hour later, now evening, a tall, cadaverous guard in a more pleasing uniform, putting an iron tray with food on it through that hole in the door. Food. And for him here. And that sallow, rickety Chinaman over the way taking his. Whom had he murdered? How? And then the savage scraping of iron trays in the various cells. Sounds that reminded him more of hungry animals being fed than men. And some of these men were actually talking as they ate and scraped. It sickened him. Gee. It's a wonder them guys in the mush gallery couldn't think of something else besides cold beans and fried potatoes and coffee. The coffee tonight. Oh, boy. Now in the jail at Buffalo, though. Oh, cut it out, came from another corner. We've heard enough about the jail at Buffalo and your swell chow. You don't show any afternoon tea appetite around here, I notice. Just the same, continued the first voice, as I look back on now, it must have been pretty good. That's the way it seems, anyhow, now. Oh, Rafferty, do let up, called still another. And then, presumably Rafferty once more, who said, "Now, I'll just take a little siesta after this, and then I'll call me chauffeur and go for a little spin. The air tonight must be fine." Then from still another hoarse voice, "Oh, you with your sick imagination. Say, I'd give me life for a smoker. And then a good game of cards." "Do they play cards here?" thought Clyde. "I suppose since Rosenstein was defeated for mayor here he won't play. Won't he, though?" This presumably from Rosenstein. To Clyde's left, in the cell next to him, a voice, to a passing guard, low and yet distinctly audible, "PSST. Any word from Albany yet?" "No word, Herman. And no letter, I suppose." "No letter." The voice was very strained, very tense, very miserable, and after this, silence. A moment later, from another cell farther off, a voice from the lowest hell to which a soul can descend, complete and unutterable despair, "Oh, my God! Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" And then from the tier above another voice, "Oh, Jesus! Is that farmer going to begin again? I can't stand it. Guard! Guard! Can't you get some dope for that guy?" Once more the voice from the lowest, "Oh, my God! Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" Clyde was up, his fingers clenched. His nerves were as taut as cords about to snap. A murderer. And about to die, perhaps. Or grieving over some terrible thing like his own fate. Moaning, as he in spirit at least had so often moaned there in Bridgeburg. Crying like that. God. And there must be others. And day after day and night after night more of this, no doubt, until, maybe, who could tell, unless. But, oh, no. Oh, no. Not himself, not that, not his day. Oh, no. A whole year must elapse before that could possibly happen, or so Jefferson had said. Maybe two. But, at that. In 2 years. He found himself stricken with an ague because of the thought that even in so brief a time as 2 years. That other room. It was in here somewhere too. This room was connected with it. He knew that. There was a door. It led to that chair. That chair. And then the voice again, as before, "Oh, my God! Oh, my God!" He sank to his couch and covered his ears with his hands. Chapter 29. The death house in this particular prison was one of those grass erections and maintenances of human insensitiveness and stupidity principally for which no one primarily was really responsible. Indeed, its total plan and procedure were the results of a series of primary legislative enactments, followed by decisions and compulsions as devised by the temperaments and seeming necessities of various wardens, until at last, by degrees and without anything worthy of the name of thinking on anyone's part, there had been gathered and was now being enforced all that could possibly be imagined in the way of unnecessary and really unauthorized cruelty or stupid and destructive torture. And to the end that a man, once condemned by a jury, would be compelled to suffer not alone the death for which his sentence called, but 1,000 others before that. For the very room by its arrangement, as well as the rules governing the lives and actions of the inmates, was sufficient to bring about this torture, willy-nilly. It was a room 30 by 50 feet, of stone and concrete and steel, and surmounted some 30 feet from the floor by a skylight. Presumably an improvement over an older and worse death house, with which it was still connected by a door, it was divided lengthwise by a broad passage, along which, on the ground floor, were 12 cells, 6 on a side and 8 by 10 each and facing each other. And above again a second tier of what were known as balcony cells, 5 on a side. There was, however, at the center of this main passage, and dividing these lower cells equally as to number, a second and narrower passage, which at one end gave into what was now known as the old death house, where at present only visitors to the inmates of the new death house were received, and at the other into the execution room in which stood the electric chair. 2 of the cells on the lower passage, those at the junction of the narrower passage, faced the execution room door. The 2 opposite these, on the corresponding corners, faced the passage that gave into the old death house or what now by a large stretch of the imagination, could be called the condemned men's reception room, where twice weekly an immediate relative or a lawyer might be met. But no others. In the old death house, or present reception room, the cells still there, and an integral part of this reception plan, were all in a row and on one side only of a corridor, thus preventing prying inspection by one inmate of another, and with a wire screen in front as well as green shades which might be drawn in front of each cell. For, in an older day, whenever a new convict arrived or departed, or took his daily walk, or went for his bath, or was led eventually through the little iron door to the west where formerly was the execution chamber, these shades were drawn. He was not supposed to be seen by his associates. Yet the old death house, because of this very courtesy and privacy, although intense solitude, was later deemed inhuman, and hence this newer and better death house, as the thoughtful and condescending authorities saw it, was devised. In this, to be sure, were no such small and gloomy cells as those which characterized the old, for there the ceiling was low and the sanitary arrangements wretched, whereas in the new one the ceiling was high, the rooms and corridors brightly lighted and in every instance no less than 8 by 10 feet in size. But by contrast with the older room, they had the enormous disadvantage of the unscreened if not uncurtained cell doors. Besides, by housing all together in 2 such tiers as were here, it placed upon each convict the compulsion of enduring all the horrors of all the vicious, morbid or completely collapsed and despairing temperaments about him. No true privacy of any kind. By day, a blaze of light pouring through an overarching skylight high above the walls. By night, glistening incandescents of large size and power which flooded each nook and cranny of the various cells. No privacy, no games other than cards and checkers, the only ones playable without releasing the prisoners from their cells. Books, newspapers, to be sure, for all who could read or enjoy them under the circumstances. And visits, mornings and afternoons, as a rule, from a priest, and less regularly from a rabbi and a Protestant minister, each offering his sympathies or services to such as would accept them. But the curse of the place was not because of these advantages, such as they were, but in spite of them, this unremitted contact, as anyone could see, with minds now terrorized and discolored by the thought of an approaching death that was so near for many that it was as an icy hand upon the brow or shoulder. And none, whatever the bravado, capable of enduring it without mental or physical deterioration in some form. The glooms, the strains, the indefinable terrors and despairs that blew like winds or breaths about this place and depressed or terrorized all by turns. They were manifest at the most unexpected moments, by curses, sighs, tears, even calls for a song, for God's sake or the most unintended and unexpected yells or groans. Worse yet, and productive of perhaps the most grinding and destroying of all the miseries here, the transverse passage leading between the old death house on the one hand and the execution chamber on the other. For this from time to time, alas, how frequently, was the scene or stage for at least a part of the tragedy that was here so regularly enacted, the final business of execution. For through this passage, on his last day, a man was transferred from his better cell in the new building, where he might have been incarcerated for so much as a year or two, to one of the older ones in the old death house, in order that he might spend his last hours in solitude, although compelled at the final moment, nonetheless, the death march, to retrace his steps along this narrower cross passage, and where all might see, into the execution chamber at the other end of it. Also at any time, in going to visit a lawyer or relative brought into the old death house for this purpose, it was necessary to pass along the middle passage to this smaller one and so into the old death house, there to be housed in a cell, fronted by a wire screen 2 feet distant, between which and the cell proper a guard must sit while a prisoner and his guest, wife, son, mother, daughter, brother, lawyer, should converse, the guard hearing all. No hand clasps, no kisses, no friendly touches of any kind, not even an intimate word that a listening guard might not hear. And when the fatal hour for anyone had at last arrived, every prisoner, if sinister or simple, sensitive or of rugged texture, was actually if not intentionally compelled to hear if not witness the final preparations, the removal of the condemned man to one of the cells of the older death house, the final and perhaps sweeping visit of a mother, son, daughter, father. No thought in either the planning or the practice of all this of the unnecessary and unfair torture for those who were brought here, not to be promptly executed, by any means, but rather to be held until the higher courts should have passed upon the merits of their cases, an appeal. At first, of course, Clyde sensed little if anything of all this. In so far as his first day was concerned, he had but tasted the veriest spoonful of it all. And to lighten or darken his burden his mother came at noon the very next day. Not having been permitted to accompany him, she had waited over for a final conference with Belknap and Jeffson, as well as to write in full her personal impressions in connection with her son's departure, those nervously searing impressions, and although anxious to find a room somewhere near the penitentiary, she hurried first to the office of the penitentiary immediately upon her arrival at Auburn and, after presenting an order from Justice Oberwalzer as well as a solicitous letter from Belknap and Jeffson urging the courtesy of a private interview with Clyde to begin with at least, she was permitted to see her son in a room entirely apart from the old death house. For already the warden himself had been reading of her activities and sacrifices and was interested in seeing not only her but Clyde also. But so shaken was she by Clyde's so sudden and amazingly changed appearance here that she could scarcely speak upon his entrance, even in recognition of him, so blanched and grey were his cheeks and so shadowy and strained his eyes. His head clipped that way. This uniform. And in this dreadful place of iron gates and locks and long passages with uniformed guards at every turn. For a moment she winced and trembled, quite faint under the strain, although previous to this she had entered many a jail and larger prison, in Kansas City, Chicago, Denver, and delivered tracts and exhortations and proffered her services in connection with anything she might do. But this, her own son. Her broad, strong bosom began to heave. She looked, and then turned her heavy, broad back to hide her face for the nonce. Her lips and chin quivered. She began to fumble in the small bag she carried for her handkerchief at the same time that she was muttering to herself, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" But even as she did so there came the thought, no, he must not see her so. What a way was this to do, and by her tears weaken him? And yet despite her great strength she could not now cease at once but cried on. And Clyde seeing this, and despite his previous determination to bear up and say some comforting and heartening word to his mother, now began, "But you mustn't, Ma. Gee, you mustn't cry. I know it's hard on you. But I'll be all right. Sure I will. It isn't as bad as I thought." Yet inwardly saying, "Oh, God how bad." And Mrs. Griffiths adding aloud, "My poor boy. My beloved son. But we mustn't give way. No. Behold, I will deliver thee out of the snares of the wicked. God has not deserted either of us. And he will not, that I know. He leadeth me by the still waters. He restoreth my soul. We must put our trust in him. Besides," she added, briskly and practically, as much to strengthen herself as Clyde, "haven't I already arranged for an appeal? It is to be made yet this week. They're going to file a notice. And that means that your case can't even be considered under a year. But it is just the shock of seeing you so. You see, I wasn't quite prepared for it." She straightened her shoulders and now looked up and achieved a brave if strained smile. "The warden here seems very kind, but still, somehow, when I saw you just now," she dabbed at her eyes which were damp from this sudden and terrific storm, and to divert herself as well as him she talked of the so very necessary work before her. Messrs. Belknap and Jeffson had been so encouraging to her just before she left. She had gone to their office and they had urged her and him to be of good cheer. And now she was going to lecture, and at once, and would soon have means to do it that way. Oh, yes. And Mr. Jeffson would be down to see him one of these days soon. He was by no means to feel that the legal end of all this had been reached. Far from it. The recent verdict and sentence was sure to be reversed and a new trial ordered. The recent one was a farce, as he knew. And as for herself, as soon as she found a room near the prison, she was going to the principal ministers of Auburn and see if she could not secure a church, or two, or three, in which to speak and plead his cause. Mr. Jeffson was mailing her some information she could use within a day or two. And after that, other churches in Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, Schenectady, in fact many cities in the East, until she had raised the necessary sum. But she would not neglect him. She would see him at least once a week and would write him a letter every other day, or maybe even daily if she could. She would talk to the warden. So he must not despair. She had much hard work ahead of her, of course, but the Lord would guide her in all that she undertook. She knew that. Had he not already shown his gracious and miraculous mercy? Clyde must pray for her and for himself. Read Isaiah. Read the Psalms, the 23rd and the 51st and 91st daily. Also Habakkuk. Are there walls against the hand of the Lord? And then after more tears, an utterly moving and macerating scene, at last achieving her departure while Clyde, shaken to his soul by so much misery, returned to his cell. His mother. And at her age, and with so little money, she was going out to try to raise the money necessary to save him. And in the past he had treated her so badly, as he now saw. He sat down on the side of his cot and held his head in his hands the while outside the prison, the iron door of the same closed and only a lonely room and the ordeal of her proposed lecture tour ahead of her. Mrs. Griffiths paused, by no means so assured or convinced of all she had said to Clyde. To be sure God would aid her. He must. Had he ever failed her yet, completely? And now, here in her darkest hour, her son's. Would he? She paused for a moment a little later in a small parking place, beyond the prison, to stare at the tall, gray walls, the watchtowers with armed guards in uniform, the barred windows and doors. A penitentiary. And her son was now within, worse yet, in that confined and narrow death house. And doomed to die in an electric chair. Unless, but, no, that should not be. It could not be. That appeal. The money for it. She must busy herself as to that at once, not think or brood or despair. Oh, no. My shield and my buckler. My light and my strength. Oh, Lord, Thou art my strength and my deliverance. In Thee will I trust. And then dabbing at her eyes once more and adding, Oh, Lord, I believe. Help Thou mine unbelief. So Mrs. Griffiths, alternately praying and crying as she walked. Chapter 30. But after this the long days in prison for Clyde. Except for a weekly visit from his mother, who, once she was entered upon her work, found it difficult to see him more often than that, traveling as she did in the next 2 months between Albany and Buffalo and even New York City, but without the success she had at first hoped for. For in the matter of her appeal to the churches and the public, as most wearily, and in secret if not to Clyde, and after 3 weeks of more or less regional and purely sectarian trying, she was compelled to report the Christians at least were very indifferent, not as Christian as they should be. For as all, but more particularly the ministers of the region, since they most guardedly and reservedly represented their congregations in every instance, unanimously saw it, here was a notorious and, of course, most unsavory trial which had resulted in a conviction with which the more conservative element of the country, if one could judge by the papers at least, were in agreement. Besides, who was this woman, as well as her son? An exhorter, a secret preacher, one who in defiance of all the tenets and processes of organized and historic, as well as hieratic, religious powers and forms, theological seminaries, organized churches and their affiliations and product, all carefully and advisedly and legitimately because historically and dogmatically interpreting the Word of God, choosing to walk forth and without ordination after any fashion conduct an unauthorized and hence nondescript mission. Besides, if she had remained at home, as a good mother should, and devoted herself to her son, as well as to her other children, their care and education, would this, have happened? And not only that, but according to Clyde's own testimony in this trial, had he not been guilty of adultery with this girl, whether he had slain her or not? A sin almost equal to murder in many minds. Had he not confessed it? And was an appeal for a convicted adulterer, if not murderer, who could tell as to that, to be made in a church? No Christian church was the place to debate, and for a charge, the merits of this case, however much each Christian of each and every church might sympathize with Mrs. Griffiths personally, or resent any legal injustice that might have been done her son. No. It was not morally advisable. It might even tend to implant in the minds of the young some of the details of the crime. Besides, because of what the newspapers had said of her coming east to aid her son and the picture that she herself presented in her homely garb, it was assumed by most ministers that she was one of those erratic persons, not a constituent of any definite sect, or schooled theology, who tended by her very appearance to cast contempt on true and pure religion. And in consequence, each in turn, not hardening his heart exactly, but thinking twice, and deciding no, there must be some better way, less troublesome to Christians, a public hall, perhaps, to which Christians, if properly appealed to through the press, might well repair. And so Mrs. Griffiths, in all but one instance, rejected in that fashion and told to go elsewhere, while in regard to the Catholics, instinctively, because of prejudice, as well as a certain dull wisdom not inconsistent with the facts, she failed even to so much as think of them. The mercies of Christ as interpreted by the holder of the sacred keys of St. Peter, as she knew, were not for those who failed to acknowledge the authority of the Vicar of Christ. And therefore after many days spent in futile knockings here and there she was at last compelled, and in no little depression, to appeal to a Jew who controlled the principal moving picture theater of Utica, a sinful theater. And from him, this she secured free for a morning address on the merits of her son's case, a mother's appeal for her son, it was entitled, which netted her, at 25 cents per person, the amazing sum of $200. At first this sum, small as it was, so heartened her that she was now convinced that soon, whatever the attitude of the Orthodox Christians, she would earn enough for Clyde's appeal. It might take time, but she would. Nevertheless, as she soon discovered, there were other factors to be considered: car fare, her own personal expenses in Utica and elsewhere, to say nothing of certain very necessary sums to be sent to Denver to her husband, who had little or nothing to go on at present, and who, because of this very great tragedy in the family, had been made ill, so ill indeed that the letters from Frank and Julia were becoming very disturbing. It was possible that he might not get well at all. Some help was necessary there. And in consequence, in addition to paying her own expenses here, Mrs. Griffiths was literally compelled to deduct other reducing sums from this, her present and only source of income. It was terrible, considering Clyde's predicament, but nevertheless must she not sustain herself in every way in order to win to victory? She could not reasonably abandon her husband in order to aid Clyde alone. Yet in the face of this, as time went on, the audiences growing smaller and smaller until at last they constituted little more than a handful, and barely paying her expenses, although through this process nonetheless she finally managed to put aside, over and above all her expenses, $1,100. Yet, also, just at this time, and in a moment of extreme anxiety, Frank and Julia wiring her that if she desired to see Asa again she had better come home at once. He was exceedingly low and not expected to live. Whereupon, played upon by these several difficulties and there being no single thing other than to visit him once or twice a week, as her engagements permitted, which she could do for Clyde, she now hastily conferred with Belknap and Jeffson, setting forth her extreme difficulties. And these, seeing that $1,100 of all she had thus far collected was to be turned over to them, now, in a burst of humanity, advised her to return to her husband. Decidedly Clyde would do well enough for the present, seeing that there was an entire year, or at least 10 months before it was necessary to file the record and the briefs in the case. In addition, another year assuredly must elapse before a decision could be reached. And no doubt before that time the additional part of the appeal fee could be raised. Or, if not, well, then, anyhow, seeing how worn and astray she was at this time, she need not worry. Messrs. Belknap and Jeffson would see to it that her son's interests were properly protected. They would file an appeal and make an argument, and do whatever else was necessary to ensure her son a fair hearing at the proper time. And with that great burden off her mind, and 2 last visits to Clyde in which she assured him of her determination to return as speedily as possible, once ASA was restored to strength again and she could see her way to financing such a return, she now departed only to find that, once she was in Denver once more, it was not so easy to restore him by any means. And in the meantime Clyde was left to cogitate on and make the best of a world that at its best was a kind of inferno of mental ills, above which, as above Dante's might have been written, abandon hope, ye who enter here. The somberness of it. Its slow and yet searing psychic force. The obvious terror and depression, constant and unshakable of those who, in spite of all their courage or their fears, their bravado or their real indifference, there were even those, were still compelled to think and wait. For, now, in connection with this coldest and bitterest form of prison life he was in constant psychic, if not physical contact, with 20 other convicted characters of varying temperaments and nationalities, each one of whom, like himself, had responded to some heat or lust or misery of his nature or his circumstances. And with murder, a mental as well as physical explosion, as the final outcome or concluding episode which, being detected, and after what horrors and wearinesses of mental as well as legal contest and failure, such as fairly paralleled his own, now found themselves islanded, immured, in one or another of these 22 iron cages and awaiting what? How well they knew. And how well he knew. And here with what loud public rages and despairs or prayers, at times. At others, what curses, foul or coarse jests, or tales addressed to all, or ribald laughter, or sighings and groanings in these later hours when the straining spirit having struggled to silence, there was supposedly rest for the body and the spirit. In an exercise court, beyond the farthermost end of the long corridor, twice daily, for a few minutes each time, between the hours of 10 and 5, the various inmates in groups of 5 or 6 were led forth, to breathe, to walk, to practice calisthenics, or run and leap as they chose. But always under the watchful eyes of sufficient guards to master them in case they attempted rebellion in any form. And to this it was, beginning with the second day, that Clyde himself was led, now with one set of men and now with another. But with the feeling at first strong in him that he could not share in any of these public activities which, nevertheless, these others, and in spite of their impending doom, seemed willing enough to indulge in. The 2 dark-eyed sinister-looking Italians, one of whom had slain a girl because she would not marry him, the other who had robbed and then slain and attempted to burn the body of his father-in-law in order to get money for himself and his wife. And Big Larry Donahue, square-headed, square-shouldered, big of feet and hands, an overseas soldier, who, being ejected from a job as night watchman in a Brooklyn factory, had lain for the foreman who had discharged him, and then killed him on an open common somewhere at night, but without the skill to keep from losing a service medal which had eventually served to betray and identify him. Clyde had learned all this from the strangely indifferent and non-committal, yet seemingly friendly guards, who were over these cells by night and by day, 2 and 2, turn-about, who relieved each other every 8 hours. And Police Officer Reardon of Rochester, who had killed his wife because she was determined to leave him, and now, himself, was to die. And Thomas Moorer, the young farmer or farmhand, as he really was, whom Clyde on his first night had heard moaning, a man who had killed his employer with a pitchfork, and was soon to die now, as Clyde heard, and who walked and walked, keeping close to the wall, his head down, his hands behind his back, a rude, strong, loutish man of about 30, who looked more beaten and betrayed than as though he had been able to torture or destroy another. Clyde wondered about him, his real guilt. Again Miller Nicholson, a lawyer of Buffalo of perhaps 40 years of age who was tall and slim and decidedly superior looking, a refined, intellectual type, one you would have said was no murderer, any more than Clyde, to look at, who, nonetheless was convicted of poisoning an old man of great wealth and afterwards attempting to convert his fortune to his own use. Yet decidedly with nothing in his look or manner, as Clyde felt, at least, which marked him as one so evil, a polite and courteous man, who, noting Clyde on the very first morning of his arrival here, approached and said, "Scared?" but in the most gentle and solicitous tone, as Clyde could hear and feel, even though he stood blank and icy, afraid almost to move, or think. Yet in this mood, and because he felt so truly done for, replying, "Yes, I guess I am." But once it was out, wondering why he had said it, so weak a confession, and afterwards something in the man heartening him, wishing that he had not. "Your name's Griffiths, isn't it?" "Yes." "Well, my name's Nicholson. Don't be frightened. You'll get used to it." He achieved a cheerful, if wan smile. But his eyes, they did not seem like that, no smile there. "I don't suppose I'm so scared either," replied Clyde, trying to modify his first, quick and unintended confession. "Well, that's good. Be game. We all have to be here, or the whole place would go crazy. Better breathe a little. Or walk fast. It'll do you good." He moved away a few paces and began exercising his arms while Clyde stood there, saying, almost loudly, so shaken was he still, "We all have to be or the whole place would go crazy." That was true, as he could see and feel after that first night. Crazy, indeed. Tortured to death, maybe, by being compelled to witness these terrible and completely destroying, and for each, impending tragedies. But how long would he have to endure this? How long would he? In the course of a day or two, again he found this death house was not quite like that either, not all terror, on the surface at least. It was in reality, and in spite of impending death in every instance, a place of taunt and jibe and jest, even games, athletics, the stage, all forms of human contest of skill, or the arguments on every conceivable topic from death and women to lack of it, as far at least as the general low intelligence of the group permitted. For the most part, as soon as breakfast was over, among those who were not called upon to join the first group for exercise, there were checkers or cards, two games that were played, not with a single set of checkers or a deck of cards between groups released from their cells, but by one of the ever-present keepers providing two challenging prisoners, if it were checkers, with one checkerboard but no checkers. They were not needed. Thereafter the opening move was called by one. I moved from G2 to E1, each square being numbered, each side lettered, the moves checked with a pencil. Thereafter the second party, having recorded this move on his own board and having studied the effect of it on his own general position, would call, "I move from E7 to F5. If more of those present decided to join in this, either on one side or the other, additional boards and pencils were passed to each signifying his desire. Then Shorty Bristol, desiring to aid Dutch Swart, 3 cells down, might call, "I wouldn't do that, Dutch. Wait a minute, there's a better move than that." And so on with taunts, oaths, laughter, arguments, according to the varying fortunes and difficulties of the game. And so, too, with cards. These were played with each man locked in his cell, yet quite as successfully. But Clyde did not care for cards, or for these jibing and coarse hours of conversation. There was for him, and with the exception of the speech of one, Nicholson, alone, too much ribald and even brutal talk which he could not appreciate. But he was drawn to Nicholson. He was beginning to think after a time, a few days, that this lawyer, his presence and companionship during the exercise hour, whenever they chanced to be in the same set, could help him to endure this. He was the most intelligent and respectable man here. The others were also different, taciturn at times, and for the most part so sinister, crude or remote. But then and that not more than a week after his coming here, and when, because of his interest in Nicholson, he was beginning to feel slightly sustained at least. The execution of Pasquale Cutroni, of Brooklyn, an Italian, convicted of the slaying of his brother for attempting to seduce his wife. He had one of the cells nearest the transverse passage, so Clyde learned after arriving, and had in part lost his mind from worrying. At any rate, he was invariably left in his cell when the others, in groups of 6, were taken for exercise. But the horror of his emaciated face, as Clyde passed and occasionally looked in, a face divided into 3 grim panels by 2 gutters or prison lines of misery that led from the eyes to the corners of the mouth. Beginning with Clyde's arrival, as he learned, Pasquale had begun to pray night and day. For already, before that, he had been notified of the approximate date of his death, which was to be within the week. And after that he was given to crawling up and down his cell on his hands and knees, kissing the floor, licking the feet of a brass Christ on a cross that had been given him. Also, he was repeatedly visited by an Italian brother and sister fresh from Italy, and for whose benefit at certain hours, he was removed to the old death house. But as all now whispered, Pasquale was mentally beyond any help that might lie in brothers or sisters. All night long and all day long, when they were not present, he did this crawling to and fro and praying, and those who were awake and trying to read to pass the time, were compelled to listen to his mumbled prayers, the click of the beads of a rosary on which he was numbering numberless Our Fathers and Hail Marys. And though there were voices which occasionally said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, if he would only sleep a little still on," and the tap of his forehead on the floor, in prayer, until at last the fatal day preceding the one on which he was to die, when Pasquale was taken from his cell here and escorted to another in the old death house beyond, and where, before the following morning, as Clyde later learned, last farewells, if any, were to be said. Also, he was to be allowed a few hours in which to prepare his soul for his Maker. But throughout that night, what a strange condition was this that settled upon all who were of this fatal room. Few ate any supper, as the departing trays showed. There was silence, and after that mumbled prayers on the part of some, not so greatly removed by time from Pasquale's fate, as they knew. One Italian, sentenced for the murder of a bank watchman, became hysterical, screamed, dashed the chair and table of his cell against the bars of his door, tore the sheets of his bed to shreds, and even sought to strangle himself before eventually he was overpowered and removed to a cell in a different part of the building to be observed as to his sanity. As for the others, throughout this excitement, one could hear them walking and mumbling or calling to the guards to do something. And as for Clyde, never having experienced or imagined such a scene, he was literally shivering with fear and horror. All through the last night of this man's life he lay on his pallet, chasing phantoms. So this was what death was like here. Men cried, prayed, they lost their minds, yet the deadly process was in no way halted, for all their terror. Instead, at 10 o'clock, and in order to quiet all those who were left, a cold lunch was brought in and offered, but with none eating save the Chinaman over the way. And then at 4 the following morning, the keepers in charge of the deadly work coming silently along the main passage and drawing the heavy green curtains with which the cells were equipped so that none might see the fatal procession which was yet to return along the transverse passage from the old death house to the execution room. And yet with Clyde and all the others waking and sitting up at the sound. It was here, the execution. The hour of death was at hand. This was the signal. In their separate cells, many of those who through fear or contrition, or because of innate religious convictions, had been recalled to some form of shielding or comforting faith, were upon their knees praying. Among the rest were others who merely walked or muttered. And still others who screamed from time to time in an incontrollable fever of terror. As for Clyde, he was numb and dumb. Almost thoughtless. They were going to kill that man in that other room in there. That chair that he had so greatly feared this long while was in there, was so close now. Yet his time, as Jeffson and his mother had told him, was so long and distant as yet, if ever it was to be, if ever, but now other sounds. Certain walkings to and fro. A cell door clanking somewhere. Then plainly the door leading from the old death house into this room opening, for there was a voice, several voices indistinct as yet. Then another voice a little clearer as if someone praying. That telltale shuffling of feet as a procession moved across and through that passage. Lord have mercy. Christ have mercy. Mary, Mother of Grace, Mary, Mother of Mercy, Saint Michael, pray for me, my good angel, pray for me. Holy Mary, pray for me, Saint Joseph, pray for me. Saint Ambrose, pray for me, all ye saints and angels, pray for me. Saint Michael, pray for me, my good angel, pray for me. It was the voice of the priest accompanying the doomed man and reciting a litany. Yet he was no longer in his right mind, they said. And yet was not that his voice mumbling too? It was. Clyde could tell. He had heard it too much recently. And now that other door would be opened. He would be looking through it, this condemned man, so soon to be dead, at it, seeing it, that cap, those straps. Oh, he knew all about those by now, though they should never come to be put upon him, maybe. Goodbye, Cutrone. It was a hoarse, shaky voice from some nearby cell, Clyde could not tell which. Go to a better world than this. And then other voices, goodbye, Cutrone. God keep you, even though you can't talk English. The procession had passed. That door was shut. He was in there now. They were strapping him in, no doubt. Asking him what more he had to say, he who was no longer quite right in his mind. Now the straps must be fastened on, surely. The cap pulled down. In a moment, surely, and then, although Clyde did not know or notice at the moment, a sudden dimming of the lights in this room, as well as over the prison, an idiotic or thoughtless result of having one electric system to supply the death voltage and the incandescence of this and all other rooms. And instantly a voice calling, "There she goes. That's one. Well, it's all over with him." And a second voice, "Yes, he's topped off, poor devil." And then after the lapse of a minute perhaps, a second dimming lasting for 30 seconds, and finally a third dimming. There, sure, that's the end now. Yes. He knows what's on the other side now. Thereafter silence, a deadly hush with later some murmured prayers here and there. But with Clyde cold and with a kind of shaking ague. He dared not think, let alone cry. So that's how it was. They drew the curtains. And then, he was gone now. Those 3 dimmings of the lights. Sure, those were the flashes. And after all those nights at prayer. Those moanings. Those beatings of his head. And only a minute ago he had been alive, walking by there. But now dead. And someday how could he be sure that he would not? How could he? He shook and shook, lying on his couch, face down. The keepers came and ran up the curtains, as sure and secure in their lives apparently as though there was no death in the world. And afterwards he could hear them talking, not to him so much, he had proved too reticent thus far, but to some of the others. Poor Pasquale. This whole business of the death penalty was all wrong. The warden thought so. So did they. He was working to have it abolished. But that man. His prayers. And now he was gone. His cell over there was empty and another man would be put in it, to go to, later. Someone, many, like Cutrone, like himself, had been in this one, on this pallet. He sat up, moved to the chair. But they, had sat on that, too. He stood up, only to sink down on the pallet again. God. 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 He now exclaimed to himself, but not aloud, and yet not unlike that other man who had so terrorized him on the night of his arrival here and who is still here. But he would go too. And all of these others, and himself maybe, unless. He had seen his first man die. Chapter 31. In the meantime, however, Asa's condition had remained serious, and it was 4 entire months before it was possible for him to sit up again or for Mrs. Griffiths to dream of resuming her lecturing scheme. But by that time, Public interest in her and her son's fate was considerably reduced. No Denver paper was interested to finance her return for anything she could do for them. And as for the public in the vicinity of the crime, it remembered Mrs. Griffiths and her son most clearly, and in so far as she was concerned, sympathetically, but only, on the other hand, to think of him as one who probably was guilty and in that case, being properly punished for his crime, that it would be as well if an appeal were not taken, or, if it were, that it be refused. These guilty criminals with their interminable appeals. And with Clyde where he was, more and more executions, although as he found, and to his invariable horror, no one ever became used to such things there. Farmhand Moorer for the slaying of his former employer, Officer Reardon for the slaying of his wife, and a fine upstanding officer too but a minute before his death. And afterwards, within a month, the going of the Chinaman, who seemed, for some reason, to endure a long time, and without a word in parting to anyone, although it was well known that he spoke a few words of English. And after him Larry Donahue, the overseas soldier, with a grand call, just before the door closed behind, "Goodbye boys. Good luck." And after him again, but, oh, that was so hard. So much closer to Clyde, so depleting to his strength to think of bearing this deadly life here without, Miller Nicholson, no less. For after 5 months in which they had been able to walk and talk and call to each other from time to time from their cells, and Nicholson had begun to advise him as to books to read, as well as one important point in connection with his own case, on appeal, or in the event of any second trial, that is, that the admission of Roberta's letters as evidence, as they stood, at least, be desperately fought on the ground that the emotional force of them was detrimental in the case of any jury anywhere, to a calm unbiased consideration of the material facts presented by them, and that instead of the letters being admitted as they stood they should be digested for the facts alone, and that digest, and that only offered to the jury. If your lawyers can get the Court of Appeals to agree to the soundness of that, you will win your case sure. And Clyde at once, after inducing a personal visit on the part of Jeffson, laying this suggestion before him and hearing him say that it was sound and that he and Belknap would assuredly incorporate it in their appeal. Yet not so long after that the guard, after locking his door on returning from the courtyard, whispered, with a nod in the direction of Nicholson's cell, his next. "Did he tell you?" "Within 3 days." And at once Clyde shriveling, the news playing upon him as an icy and congealing breath. For he had just come from the courtyard with him where they had walked and talked of another man who had just been brought in, a Hungarian of Utica who was convicted of burning his paramour, in a furnace, then confessing it, a huge, rough, dark, ignorant man with a face like a gargoyle. And Nicholson saying he was more animal than man, he was sure. Yet no word about himself. And in 3 days. And he could walk and talk as though there was nothing to happen, although, according to the guard, he had been notified the night before. And the next day the same, walking and talking as though nothing had happened, looking up at the sky and breathing the air. Yet Clyde, his companion, too sick and feverish, too awed and terrified from merely thinking on it all night to be able to say much of anything as he walked, but thinking, and he can walk here. And be so calm. What sort of a man is this? And feeling enormously overawed and weakened. The following morning Nicholson did not appear, but remained in his cell destroying many letters he had received from many places. And near noon, calling to Clyde, who was 2 cells removed from him on the other side, "I'm sending you something to remember me by." But not a word as to his going. And then the guard bringing 2 books, Robinson Crusoe and the Arabian Nights. That night Nicholson's removal from his cell, and the next morning before dawn the curtains, the same procession passing through, which was by now an old story to Clyde. But somehow this was so different, so intimate, so cruel. And as he passed, calling, "God bless you all. I hope you have good luck and get out." And then that terrible stillness that followed the passing of each man. And Clyde thereafter, lonely, terribly so. Now there was no one here, no one, in whom he was interested. He could only sit and read, and think, or pretend to be interested in what these others said, for he could not really be interested in what they said. His was a mind that, freed from the miseries that had now befallen him, was naturally more drawn to romance than to reality. Where he read at all, he preferred the light, romantic novel that pictured some such world as he would have liked to share, to anything that even approximated the hard reality of the world without, let alone this. Now what was going to become of him eventually? So alone was he. Only letters from his mother, brother and sisters. And Asa getting no better, and his mother not able to return as yet. Things were so difficult there in Denver. She was seeking a religious school in which to teach somewhere, while nursing Asa. But she was asking the Reverend Duncan Macmillan, a young minister whom she had encountered in Syracuse, in the course of her work there, to come and see him. He was so spiritual and so kindly. And she was sure, if he would but come, that Clyde would find him a helpful and a strong support in these, his dark and weary hours when she could no longer be with him herself. For while Mrs. Griffiths was first canvassing the churches and ministers of this section for aid for her son, and getting very little from any quarter, she had met the Reverend Duncan Macmillan in Syracuse, where he was conducting an independent, non-sectarian church. He was a young, and like herself or Asa, unordained minister or evangelist of, however, far stronger and more effective temperament religiously. At the time Mrs. Griffiths appeared on the scene, he had already read much concerning Clyde and Roberta, and was fairly well satisfied that, by the verdict arrived at, justice had probably been done. However, because of her great sorrow and troubled search for aid, he was greatly moved. He, himself, was a devoted son. And possessing a highly poetic and emotional though so far repressed or sublimated sex nature, he was one who, out of many in this northern region, had been touched and stirred by the crime of which Clyde was presumed to be guilty. Those highly emotional and tortured letters of Roberta's. Her seemingly sad life at Lycurgus and Belts. How often he had thought of those before ever he had encountered Mrs. Griffiths. The simple and worthy virtues which Roberta and her family had seemingly represented in that romantic, pretty country world from which they had derived. Unquestionably Clyde was guilty. And yet here, suddenly, Mrs. Griffiths, very lorn and miserable and maintaining her son's innocence. At the same time there was Clyde in his cell doomed to die. Was it possible that by any strange freak or circumstance, a legal mistake had been made and Clyde was not as guilty as he appeared? The temperament of Macmillan was exceptional, tense, exotic. A present hour Saint Bernard, Savonarola, Saint Simeon, Peter the Hermit. Thinking of life, thought, all forms and social structures as the word, the expression, the breath of God. No less. Yet room for the devil and his anger, the expelled Lucifer, going to and fro in the earth. Yet, thinking on the Beatitudes, on the Sermon on the Mount, on St. John and his direct seeing and interpretation of Christ and God. He that is not with me is against me, and he that gathereth not with me, scattereth. A strange, strong, tense, confused, merciful and too, after his fashion beautiful soul, sorrowing with misery yearning toward an impossible justice. Mrs. Griffiths in her talks with him had maintained that he was to remember that Roberta was not wholly guiltless. Had she not sinned with her son? And how was he to exculpate her entirely? A great legal mistake. Her son was being most unjustly executed, and by the pitiful but none less romantic and poetic letters of this girl which should never have been poured forth upon a jury of men at all. They were, as she now maintained, incapable of judging justly or fairly where anything sad in connection with a romantic and pretty girl was concerned. She had found that to be true in her mission work. And this idea now appealed to the Reverend Duncan as important and very likely true. And perhaps, as she now contended, if only some powerful and righteous emissary of God would visit Clyde and through the force of his faith and God's word make him see, which she was sure he did not yet, and which she in her troubled state, and because she was his mother, could not make him the blackness and terror of his sin with Roberta as it related to his immortal soul here and hereafter, then in gratitude to, reverence and faith in God, would be washed away, all his iniquity, would it not? For irrespective of whether he had committed the crime now charged against him or not, and she was convinced that he had not, was he not, nevertheless, in the shadow of the electric chair, in danger at any time through death, even before a decision should be reached, of being called before his Maker, and with the deadly sin of adultery, to say nothing of all his lies and false conduct, not only in connection with Roberta but that other girl there in Lycurgus, upon him? And by conversion and contrition should he not be purged of this? If only his soul were saved, she and he too would be at peace in this world. And after a first and later a second pleading letter from Mrs. Griffiths, in which, after she had arrived at Denver, she set forth Clyde's loneliness and need of counsel and aid, the Reverend Duncan setting forth for Auburn. And once there, having made it clear to the warden what his true purpose was, the spiritual salvation of Clyde's soul, for his own, as well as his mother and God's sake, he was at once admitted to the death house and to Clyde's presence, the very door of his cell, where he paused and looked through, observing Clyde lying most wretchedly on his cot trying to read, and then Macmillan outlining his tall, thin figure against the bars and without introduction of any kind, beginning, his head bowed in prayer, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee, the only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight, that thou mightest be justified when thou speakest and be clear when thou judgest. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, thou desireth truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean, wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide thy face from my sins, and blot out all mine iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit away from me. Restore unto me the joy of thy salvation, and uphold me with thy free spirit. Then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners will be converted unto thee. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, thou God of my salvation, and my tongue shall sing aloud of thy righteousness. O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. For thou desirest not sacrifice, else would I give it, thou delightest not in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. He paused, but only after he had intoned, and in a most sonorous and really beautiful voice, the entire 51st Psalm. And then looking up, because Clyde, much astonished, had first sat up and then risen, and curiously enticed by the clean and youthful and vigorous if pale figure had approached nearer the cell door, he now added, I bring you, Clyde, the mercy and the salvation of your God. He has called on me and I have come. He has sent me that I may say unto you, though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white, like snow. Though they be red, like crimson, they shall be as wool. Come now, let us reason together with the Lord. He paused and stared at Clyde tenderly. A warm, youthful, half smile, half romantic, played about his lips. He liked the youth and refinement of Clyde, who, on his part, was plainly taken by this exceptional figure. Another religionist, of course. But the Protestant chaplain who was here was nothing like this man, neither so arresting nor attractive. Duncan Macmillan is my name, he said, and I come from the work of the Lord in Syracuse. He has sent me, just as he sent your mother to me. She has told me all that she believes. I have read all that you have said. And I know why you are here. But it is to bring you spiritual joy and gladness that I am here. And he suddenly quoted from Psalms 13:2, How shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart, daily? That is from Psalms 13:2. And here is another thing that now comes to me as something that I should say to you. It is from the Bible, 2, the 10th Psalm, he hath said in his heart, I shall not be moved, for I shall never be in adversity. But you are in adversity, you see. We all are, who live in sin. And here is another thing that comes to me, just now to say. It is from Psalm 10:11, he hath said in his heart, God hath forgotten. He hideth his face. And I am told to say to you that he does not hide his face. Rather I am told to quote this to you from the 18th Psalm, they prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He sent from above, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He delivered me from my strong enemy. And from them which hated me, for they were too many for me. He brought me forth also unto a large place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. Clyde, those are all words addressed to you. They come to me here to say to you just as though they were being whispered to me. I am but the mouthpiece for these words spoken direct to you. Take counsel with your own heart. Turn from the shadow to the light. Let us break these bonds of misery and gloom, chase these shadows and this darkness. You have sinned. The Lord can and will forgive. Repent. Join with him who has shaped the world and keeps it. He will not spurn your faith, he will not neglect your prayers. Turn, in yourself, in the confines of this cell, and say, Lord, help me. Lord, hear thou my prayer. Lord, lighten mine eyes. Do you think there is no God, and that he will not answer you? Pray. In your trouble turn to him, not me, or any other. But to him. Pray. Speak to him. Call to him. Tell him the truth and ask for help. As surely as you are here before me, and if in your heart you truly repent of any evil you have done, truly, truly, you will hear and feel him. He will take your hand. He will enter this cell and your soul. You will know him by the peace and the light that will fill your mind and heart. Pray. And if you need me again to help you in any way, to pray with you, or to do you any service of any kind, to cheer you in your loneliness, you have only to send for me, drop me a card. I have promised your mother and I will do what I can. The warden has my address. He paused, serious and conclusive in his tone, because up to this time, Clyde had looked more curious and astonished than anything else. At the same time, because of Clyde's extreme youthfulness and a certain air of lonely dependence which marked him ever since his mother and Nicholson had gone, I'll always be in easy reach. I have a lot of religious work over in Syracuse, but I'll be glad to drop it at any time that I can really do anything more for you. And here he turned as if to go. But Clyde, now taken by him, his vital, confident and kindly manner, so different to the tense, fearful and yet lonely life here, called after him, "Oh, don't go just yet. Please don't. It's very nice of you to come and see me and I'm obliged to you. My mother wrote me you might. You see, it's very lonely here. I haven't thought much of what you were saying, perhaps, because I haven't felt as guilty as some think I am. But I've been sorry enough. And certainly anyone in here pays a good deal." His eyes looked very sad and strained. And at once, Macmillan, now deeply touched for the first time, replied, "Clyde, you needn't worry. I'll come to see you again within a week, because now I see you need me. I'm not asking you to pray because I think you are guilty of the death of Roberta Walden. I don't know. You haven't told me. Only you and God know what your sins and your sorrows are. But I do know you need spiritual help and He will give you that, oh, fully. The Lord will be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in time of trouble." He smiled as though he were now really fond of Clyde. And Clyde, feeling this and being intrigued by it, replied that there wasn't anything just then that he wanted to say except to tell his mother that he was all right, and make her feel a little better about him, maybe, if he could. Her letters were very sad, he thought. She worried too much about him. Besides, he, himself, wasn't feeling so very good, not a little run down and worried these days. Who wouldn't be in his position? Indeed, if only he could win to spiritual peace through prayer, he would be glad to do it. His mother had always urged him to pray, but up to now he was sorry to say he hadn't followed her advice very much. He looked very distrait and gloomy, the marked prison pallor having long since settled on his face. And the Reverend Duncan, now very much touched by his state, replied, "Well, don't worry, Clyde. Enlightenment and peace are surely going to come to you. I can see that. You have a Bible there, I see. Open it anywhere in Psalms and read. The 51st, 91st, 23rd. Open to St. John. Read it all, over and over. Think and pray, and think on all the things about you, the moon, the stars, the sun, the trees, the sea, your own beating heart, your body and strength, and ask yourself who made them. How did they come to be? Then, if you can't explain them, ask yourself if the one who made them and you, whoever he is, whatever he is, wherever he is, isn't strong and wise enough and kind enough to help you when you need help, provide you with light and peace and guidance, when you need them. Just ask yourself what of the maker of all this certain reality. And then ask him, the creator of it all, to tell you how and what to do. Don't doubt. Just ask and see. Ask in the night, in the day. Bow your head and pray and see. Verily, he will not fail you. I know because I have that peace." He stared at Clyde convincingly, then smiled and departed. And Clyde, leaning against his cell door, began to wonder. The Creator. His Creator. The Creator of the world. Ask and see. And yet, there was still lingering here in him that old contempt of his for religion and its fruits, the constant and yet fruitless prayers and exhortations of his father and mother. Was he going to turn to religion now, solely because he was in difficulties and frightened like these others? He hoped not. Not like that, anyway. Just the same the mood, as well as the temperament of the Reverend Duncan Macmillan, his young, forceful, convinced and dramatic body, face, eyes, now intrigued and then moved Clyde as no religionist or minister in all his life before ever had. He was interested, arrested and charmed by the man's faith, whether at once or not at all, ever, he could come to put the reliance in it that plainly this man did.